All right, we should be going. Hey, everybody. If you don't know me, my name is Corey Ethan Williamson, and I'm going to talk about portfolios today. Before we start, I want to do a quick little disclaimer. We are fighting COVID in my household, so if you hear coughing, it is my wife dying in the next room. So, portfolios is one of those things in education where you either love them or you hate them. And I'm not going to lie to you. I, as a first year teacher, was extremely intimidated by portfolios. I had used them a lot in college classes, but I didn't really have experience with them as a high school student. And once I started taking education classes, it was portfolios this, portfolios that. I was dreadfully scared to implement them into my own classroom. And once I did, it worked really, really well. I was shocked by how well it worked. And today I want to share my experience using portfolios in a Biology 1 classroom with you guys. I want to talk about the strengths, I want to talk about the weaknesses, talk about the research behind it a little bit, and just sort of give an overview of how to use these in a classroom. There we go. So, educational portfolios are a teaching strategy used to monitor student progress over time. It's often viewed as a step away from a traditional classroom setting, and there's a lot of pushback because of that. But what we're aiming to do here is promote student centered activities and to try to get them acquainted to more professional environment. Portfolios are often used in businesses. I'm sure you guys have used them at least once in a college classroom before, especially if you're in 708 because you're having to make one. But students are going to experience these pretty much no matter what they go into. And we need to get them acquainted to the idea of making a portfolio. Now, how it works is it involves students working on a singular project over basically an allotted period of time. That can be a week, a unit, or even the whole term. Using the whole term as your time period in a secondary classroom isn't really a good idea. We'll talk about why in a bit. But using it for a week, using it for 2 weeks for a unit is absolutely acceptable. It's often completed in steps to monitor student progress and graded at intervals for student ease and instructor ease. The goal is to demonstrate a complete mastery of the subject material at the end of your allotted time, with a portfolio acting as a log of your progress. What you want as an instructor implementing a portfolio in your classroom is to see student growth in the portfolio they turn into you to be basically a beautiful tapestry of where they were and where they are now. You want to be able to see the steps at which they learned something. That's what a portfolio is supposed to be, what it's supposed to do. When you have everything lined up right and all of the horrible pitfalls we'll talk about in a minute are avoided, this can be something absolutely beautiful in your classroom. So let's talk about some of the strengths. Well, first off, it allows for individualized instruction and intervention. When you are teaching in a classroom, I know most of us are teaching right now, it can be hard to meet every single student's needs. Some teachers say it's impossible. I'm kind of on the side where you can do it, but you might not do it to the level you want to do it. But portfolios are a great way to do this. A lot of them are very student centered and give a lot of free reign to students. And when you put your student at the heart of an assignment, what you're going to see is they're going to take it and they're going to turn it into something they can work with. They're going to make it a strength for them. And portfolios are an amazing way to do that. It allows for instructors to evaluate student progress without limiting creativity. That goes back to that. A lot of the really student-centered, extremely creative teaching strategies have difficulty evaluating student progress. And portfolios have that problem as well. We'll talk about that in a second. But with portfolios, you have a log of where they were at and where they are now. And you can use that data you get from that to monitor their progress. It also allows for students to reflect on their own progress, allows them to have a role in the assessment process, to have accountability. What we are trying to do with a portfolio is we are trying to elevate students' level of maturity, their level of accountability, their level of professionalism, and taking them from an environment where everything is being spoon fed to them to an environment where They are the masters of their own world. They are in charge of this portfolio assignment. It's your job as an educator to be basically their facilitator, to be their check off guy, if you will. What we are trying to do for them is make them reflect on where they are, make them see where they stand in the grand scheme of things, and give them perspective. I think that's one of the greatest strengths of a portfolio assessment is it can give students perspectives. It can let them see how much they've learned and where what they've learned fits into the unit, into the class, into life. It really depends on what you're using a portfolio assessment for. And that's a really, really beautiful thing. So portfolio assessments really first arose at a place called Stony Brook University. These two gentlemen, Peter Elbow and Pat Belanoff, began using portfolio assessments in place of a written exam for their exit level graduate students in 1983. And what we saw was a steady spread of this across universities and colleges across the country and then across the world. This mode of education, this strategy really fits well into post-secondary environments because at that point, students are already expected to be mature. They're already expected to be accountable for their own grades, accountable for their own work they turn in. And this is instructors turning them loose. It's perfect. It works great. Where things get interesting is when we try to adapt it to secondary schools. Because what we see is we have to adapt it very heavily to fit a secondary school environment because secondary education differs so drastically to universities. So when we look at our strategy and progress for secondary portfolios, it's going to be very different from how a portfolio is used at a university. When a portfolio is used at a university, they get handed a checklist and get told to complete it. We have to be a lot more structured for that for our secondary students. The reason is, they've probably never seen something like this before. They are used to being spoon-fed information and then taking a quiz on it or doing a packet on it. They're not used to creating their own long-term assignment like this. So as instructors, we need to be very, very structured. We have to be sure that we are giving constant feedback and giving very firm set rules for them to follow. If we do that, then we're set. They now know how to use a portfolio, and that will help them later on in life. It'll help them do basically all the strengths we just talked about. But it's up to us as educators to really make sure we understand how to use this strategy. Portfolios are one of those things where if it is not used correctly for high schoolers and middle schoolers, it's going to be something that's not going to be a pleasant experience for anyone. So we've got to make sure we're doing it correctly. So how do we do it correctly? Well, I've broken it down into 7 steps. Most of the sources I read actually have it about 12 steps, but I combined a couple steps just for ease, and a lot of the steps repeat themselves. So let's get into it. The first 3 steps is completely up to the instructor. You have to set a purpose. What do you want your students to learn? And then you have to set criteria. And this, in my opinion, is the most important step you can do in this process. In order to get your students to use a portfolio, you have to be firm with your rubric. You have to make sure your students know exactly what you expect of them. Otherwise, what's going to happen is they're either going to get confused and do subpar work or not do it at all, or you're going to be too loose with your rules and they're going to try to find ways to weasel out of it. We don't want that. We want them to learn, to reflect on what they've learned, and to see them grow as they do this assignment. We have to be really, really strict with our criteria and our rubric. That's not saying that we cut out student involvement. That's completely opposite of what I'm about to say in a second. What I'm saying is that we have to have a battle plan before we implement this into our classroom. Otherwise, it's going to explode and not work. So step 3, we have to decide on student involvement. This can be something as simple as handing them a checklist and saying, get it done, or you can have every single little detail laid out for them to follow. Personally, I like to have a little bit more wiggle room with portfolio assignments. I think it's a great way for students to flex their creative muscles, but we'll talk about how different classes, different subjects, different units require different criteria in a second. The next next three steps, steps 4, 5, and 6, are going to kind of repeat themselves. You've already decided how your portfolio is going to play out in your classroom. Your next step is to begin instruction, teach your material, get your students started on their portfolio and monitor their progress. Then you're going to need to provide feedback, and this is important. If your students are not doing their portfolio correctly, you need to set them straight fast. Otherwise, halfway through the portfolio, you're going to realize and they're going to realize that what they have is an unworkable mess, and we don't want that. You need to give them feedback to show them how to correct their work. Now, after you provide feedback, what's going to happen is you're going to start with step 4 again. You're going to start teaching, monitor progress, provide feedback, and what you're going to do is you're going to complete or repeat steps 4, 5, and 6 over and over and over until you complete your unit. You'll teach them something, have them work on their portfolio, provide feedback on their portfolio, teach more information, have them work on their portfolio, provide feedback on their portfolio, and just repeat this until eventually they complete it. This is a very cyclical process. It's something where you are starting off very broad and you are refining it as you go. And it's important that you don't get frustrated as an instructor. And it's important that you show to your kids that this is going to be a process. This is not going to be something they can just get done and turn it in for a grade. This is a series of steps and a series of layers to it that they're going to have to complete. So you really need to be upfront with your kids about this. Show them exactly what's expected of them, model for them how this is going to work, and then go from there. Now, I know half of what I said probably didn't make any sense. So let me explain how I've used this in my classroom before. I've used this to teach cell organelles. I teach biology 1 at Hattiesburg High School. So what I'm about to go through is a portfolio assessment I've actually done in the classroom. So same 7 steps as before. My first step was I had to figure out what exactly I wanted them to know. Well, our unit was on cell organelles, and when I was developing my criteria, I was basically able to break down what I had laid out into 3 goals. I wanted them to at least be familiar with 10 eukaryotic organelles. I wanted them to know their functions. And going back to my metaphor presentation I did a couple weeks ago, I wanted them to be able to make a comparison to something in society. So let's say that the organelle this particular student chose was a ribosome. They would have to be able to describe its function and compare it to something in society. The student I'm going to use as an example for this, or my ribosome student, compared it to a car factory. The reason I did this was I think them being able to know a cell or a cell organelle's function is more important than them knowing every single little detail about its layout. And the best way, in my experience, for them to get familiar with function is to compare it to something that they are familiar with. So I gave my students a lot of free rein with this assignment. They could write a paragraph with their comparison. They could draw a picture with their comparison, do a Venn diagram with their comparison. The only rule was for each organelle, they had to use a different method to show their comparison. One organelle they could draw, one organelle they can use a Venn diagram, one organelle they could just describe, but every organelle had to be different. So my ribosome student that I brought up, he actually drew a little car factory, but he labeled the parts of the car factory as the different parts of a ribosome. So the walls was the rRNA, and the big robotic arms that put the car together was the tRNA, and the car itself was the protein. And then for his next organelle, he would draw a Venn diagram and list of bullet points. And for the next one, he would do something different. It worked really, really well. But how I did this was I would teach 2 or 3 organelles a day. I would turn the students loose to complete 1 page of their portfolio. I did this in Google Docs because everything at Haysburg High School was done through Schoology. So it was a lot easier to just provide them with a template through Google Docs and have them complete it that way than to give them a physical copy. So they did it through Google Docs. They would complete one organelle a day and then go on to another assignment. And this was something that went over the course of 2 weeks. They had to bring up their computers and I had to give them feedback on their page each day before they had permission to go start the next assignment. And this process just continued until we had 10 days done, until they had their portfolio completed and they submitted them. And it worked really, really, really well. I did notice that students latched onto it because it was something different. It was something where it wasn't just handing them a packet or giving them guided notes and telling them there's going to be a quiz at the end of the week. This was an opportunity for them to be graded on their knowledge, on what they've learned, but in a more creative way. They were being asked to construct something. And whenever you ask kids to construct something, they are going to latch onto that. Our kids are longing for an opportunity to show themselves, to show you what they can do. And portfolio assessments are an amazing way to do that. Now, there is a lot of weaknesses to this strategy as well. Like I mentioned in the strengths, you have got to make a very firm rubric for this. Grading is subjective for portfolios. You can have the same assignment with two different teachers, the same rubric even, and they're going to grade it differently. That's just the unfortunate matter of the fact. Grading is extremely subjective. And having a firm rubric helps with that. But what happens is when teachers have to develop their own criteria for grading, and especially for new teachers, this is what was so intimidating about it to me, is that they might not know how to develop the criteria. They might not have experience making a rubric for something like this. So this is not something I would recommend for a teacher who is not confident in their classroom. Most post-secondary institutions rely on standardized test scores for admissions. Why I put this in here was I've seen where teachers have tried to use a portfolio for the entire term. And I do not recommend that for secondary students. The reason is administration is probably going to fight you on it. The reason being our universities and community colleges are going to be looking at standardized tests, whether it be your state test, your ACTs, your SATs for admissions. And anything that's taking students out of a traditional classroom environment, a lot of administration is going to look at as being a threat to this standardized test pipeline they've created. So using this for a unit or a week is great. You don't need to use this for a whole term, or administration is probably going to fight you. It is also very hard to implement in all subjects. It worked great in my biology classroom. I can see this working very well in a history classroom. I can't see this going well in a math class. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying you're going to have to be a lot more structured with a math portfolio than you would be English or Spanish portfolio. Also, this is not something I would recommend for anyone under probably 6th grade. The reason being, you're giving a lot of creative power to the students. You need to make sure they're at a maturity level where they can take this seriously. Otherwise, it's just going to be a headache for them and a headache for you. Data from portfolio assessments can also be pretty difficult to analyze. Again, that goes back to it being just so subjective. You have to be able to monitor student progress with an air of objectivity, and creating a firm rubric can help you do that. And it can be difficult within certain school environments. My students latched onto it very well. Next year's students might not. Every group of students is going to be different. Every administration that approves your portfolio is going to be different. It really depends on your school's climate. And that's really true for all teaching strategies, not just portfolios. And here are my references. Again, I really dug deep for this. When I researched something, I really like going into every little corner of this. I recommend all these articles I read about it. And I hope you guys were able to learn something. Thank you for watching.